Hello everyone and welcome back to Data Labs Ichi. My name is Adam LeBlanc and I'm going to be giving today's lecture on bias. So the purpose of today's bias lecture is going to be defining terms, going over bias in theory, how to identify bias, and then dealing with that bias once you've identified it. And then the last bullet is optional, but if you can, please enjoy the video. So first, let's define terms. So I'm using the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of bias. I don't know if you've heard of the Merriam-Webster dictionary, but it's pretty popular. So first, we have the deviation of the expected value of a statistical estimate from the quantity it estimates. An example of this could be income. Everyone knows that there are more low-income people in the world than there are high-income people in the world. If you take a statistical estimate or make a statistical estimate and your results show that there are more rich people than poor people, then you know there is some deviation from what you expect your quantities to estimate. Next, we have systematic error introduced into sampling or testing by selecting or encouraging one outcome or answer over others. Now, this is an example that everyone is probably more familiar with, and you'll understand more after I give you this example. Let's say there's a statistician who is trying to get an understanding of the number of sick people versus not sick people in a particular population. However, when he goes to take his simple random sample, he goes to the hospital sick ward. This is obviously going to show more sick people than healthy people because he's encouraging an outcome by placing himself where he knows or she knows that there are going to be more sick people. So why did we just define terms? This is going to be a common thing throughout all of my lectures. We are going to define the terms that we're going to be discussing throughout the lecture so that everyone is on the same page. This is important because you, me, your aunt, your grandmother, your best friend from college, they all have different definitions of bias. They all have different definitions of every word that has multiple definitions. So this is a simple way to make sure that everyone knows what I am talking about during our lectures. So moving on from that. So next, let's talk about bias in theory. Disclaimer, this is my theory. Everyone else is entitled to their own theory on bias or any other topic that you'd like to think about. That's the beauty of theories. Everyone is allowed to have one as long as you follow a simple set of rules in order to create a proper theory. And some could debate what those proper tools are. I like to go off the scientific method. Okay, let's get into the theory. So we have bias in red and underlined in the center of the screen. We are going to be talking about some key influencers that help define bias on an individual or from an individual's perspective. So by the end of this theory, we are going to have a pretty decent Venn diagram that you are free to use in any type of class or product that you are going to be making in the future. So morals are one of the first influencers of our bias. So everyone has their own set of morals. It doesn't matter where you got them or how you accrued them. Just know that everyone has their own set of morals. Everyone's environment is different. Our environment heavily influences the way we think about certain things, right? So our environment is a key influencer on bias as well. Then we have experiences. Everyone's personal experiences help to influence the way that they perceive certain events and certain things in the world, which is another way to say bias. So with that, we have the beginnings of a pretty decent Venn diagram. But as everyone knows, to complete a Venn diagram, we need to fill in the little pyramids that are connecting morals and environment, environment to experiences, and experiences to morals. Why, though, is the question. Well, because morals and environment are not completely separate. Something connects those together to help influence that bias. The same with experiences and environment. And then the same for experiences and morals. They are all connected to help create what your biases are. So between morals and environment, we have shared values. These shared values typically come from some sort of organization that shares our morals, but it is also an environment that you can go to be among people that have similar morals to you, creating that area of shared values. Next, between experiences and environment, we have habits. Habits are things that we do repeatedly because of things that we've learned through experience based off of our environment. An example would be prehistory, when we were hunters and gatherers. There were times when we probably ate berries that were poisonous. These poisoned berries ended up killing or really making the people who ate them sick. Therefore, we created habits that kept us alive by avoiding those particular kinds of berries. Lastly, between experience and morals, we have opinions. Now, everyone's personal morals, coupled with the experiences that they've had by just living their life, creates these opinions on certain topics. Now, that in turn leads to bias. So now with that, we've completed our Venn diagram. As you can see, the inner key influencers of shared values, habits, and opinions form the biases that you have every day. These are influenced by the morals that you hold, the environment in which you live or which you choose to be in, and the experiences that you have while just being alive. So all of these together come and combine to form the biases that you have. How to identify bias. Okay, so how are we going to go about identifying bias? So first, we're going to talk about different types of bias because there are so many different types of bias out there. I can't possibly go over all of them. So I've chosen a select few, 7 if you want an exact number, that I'm going to go over because I feel like these particular types of bias are observed or acted upon more often than other types. Now, this is different than the defining of the terms before because the terms from before that we talked about are going to directly feed into these types of biases. These are just different ways that those terms of bias that we talked about before can be used in an environment. So first, let's talk about confirmation bias. So for confirmation bias, it's a tendency to seek out information or to support particular information that you believe is already true. So for example, if I think the earth is flat, I'm going to start doing research on information that proves that the Earth is flat. I don't want to think about the Earth being round. So I'm creating that bias against round Earth theory. I only want to focus on flat Earth theory. And that in turn creates that confirmation bias. The next type of bias is going to be cultural bias. So for cultural bias, it's going to be more of a sociological bias because within this bias, we think that our society or our culture is the only right way to do things. So any other culture that is different or abnormal or exotic is wrong. Next, we're going to be going over in-group bias. So for in-group bias, it's basically talking about people who like to support someone or something within their own shared group. Now remember, if we go back to the Venn diagram, we had those shared values. This is where that bias comes into its own. In-group bias allows people that have shared values to view the world in a comfortable way that they know is not going to be challenged. And who knows? They could be right. It'd be biased to think otherwise. Next, we're going to talk about availability bias. Availability bias is a type of heuristic, and this is the tendency to use information that we can quickly recall when evaluating a certain topic or idea. It's not always the best representation of the topic, but because it was easy information to remember and it was quickly available, we tend to believe that that is the correct information, having bias towards anything that says otherwise. Next, we're going to talk about observer bias. So observer bias is common, but it's kind of hard to understand or identify when it's happening. It's mostly the evaluation of another person's influence on their own inherent biases. So you're talking about your own bias and how it's being affected by bias. An example of this would be scientists in the field of quantum mechanics have a certain way that they view and believe the world works. Individuals that are not within the realm of quantum mechanics have a different set of biases and beliefs on how the world works. But the people that are not scientists don't have the same information. They have not made the same observations that the scientists in the quantum field have made. Therefore, the biases can't possibly be the same. So that scientist's observation and knowledge is creating a bias towards a certain way of thinking. So next we have anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is also known as focalism. And this is a very simple type of bias. And it's also very similar to that availability bias that we talked about before. But where availability bias was more based on what the easiest bit of information was to believe, anchoring bias is based off the first piece of information that you've received ever on a topic, bases your opinion on that topic for the rest of your life. So let's just go back to that flat earth theory example we used a couple slides back. If the first thing you were told as a child about the earth was that the earth was flat, that is what your belief is going to be for the rest of your life. And if anybody comes up to you and tells you, no, you're wrong, the earth is round and here's why, you're going to have that anchoring bias, it's also called stubbornness, to believe that you are indeed correct in believing that the earth is flat. And then you are going to offer up counter theories and counter evidence saying that the earth is flat, refusing to cave and to possibly believe that another type of theory is correct. And lastly, we have hindsight bias. So hindsight bias is when people perceive events to be more predictable after they happen. Go figure, right? It's called hindsight 2020. And this makes people overconfident and overestimate their abilities to predict future outcomes of a similar nature in the future. So we've talked about identifying bias. Now let's talk about dealing with that said bias. Okay, so the first step of dealing with bias is understanding. It's helping you to understand when I'm being biased or when I could possibly be biased in the future, or when someone else is being biased as well. Being able to identify that will help you to think more logically and less emotionally. For example, let's go back to the flat earth theory. If I believe the earth is flat, well, why? Why do I think the earth is flat? What information, what evidence do I have that says the earth is flat? On the flip side, maybe I should try and identify why some of those people out there, the vast majority, myself included, think the earth is round. Why do they think the earth is round? What evidence do they have? And by understanding the evidence that they have and understanding the evidence that I have, I'm able to make a more informed decision without bias interfering, or with bias interfering in the least way possible. Next, we have peer review. This is a good one. So everyone has their own set of internal biases, right? We've gone over that. It's important once you create your product or do your experiment to send that off to someone else or a group of other people that you trust to get their opinions on it, their list of biases on it, because their bias is different than your bias. And by including them in your analysis, you are going to be able to identify where you may have been more or less biased than they were on a particular topic. Now, in the scientific community, once you do your experiment, it is expected that you send your results to a peer or group of peers, because it is now on your peers to run similar experiments to see if they come up with the same results. If they do come up with the same results, the odds are that your bias was not a heavy influencer on that experiment. If they come up with completely different results, that typically indicates that you had a set of biases put into either your results understanding or the sampling of the population, or how you gathered that information to run that experiment. Next, we have research. It's very similar to understanding, but it's inherently different. So with research, you're going to be going deep diving into trying to understand why you're biased or not biased on a particular topic. Research what types of biases affect certain outcomes. If you get a certain type of result on an experiment that you've run, on a machine learning algorithm that you've created, do some research on the common trends of why that particular error or bias is encountered. Try and identify why. Once again, similar to that understanding, but it's going to be more focused on once you've already gotten that bias result, trying to figure out how the bias was achieved and how it can be eliminated. And lastly, we have curiosity, or in the parentheses, sky's the limit. Try and just understand yourself more. Why do you think the certain way that you do? How can you change the way that you think about certain topics? Do you even want to change on certain topics or the way that you think about certain things? Just be curious. Always be hungry for more information. Always be hungry for trying to identify why certain people believe certain things, why certain groups act in certain ways. It's all part of being curious, and it can help you deal with bias in the end. So with that, we've made it to the end. Yay! In this lecture, I first defined the terms that we were going to use throughout the rest of the lecture. We went over my bias theory. Once again, yours could differ. Yours could be the same. It'd be cool if it were. How to identify the certain biases that you are going to commonly encounter, and then dealing with that bias if you even want to. I hope you enjoyed this video. These are the sources that I used for my video. This is the most important slide in my lecture. This is where I got a lot of the information on those 7 types of bias that I went over, and it's also where I got the definitions that we use when I define terms. So if you're looking to get more information on other types of biases or other definitions, please feel free to use these references to get your learn on.